Ruth. As Malcolm introduced me, I'm going to be chatting about maritime autonomy and remote operations, particularly the development of regulations. Now, I caveat this presentation with this comes from the position of a policy and regulation developer, not a legal expert. So, although I talk a lot about legislation, I may get some peculiarities and find details of it wrong. Okay. So, I am the autonomy technical specialist. I sit within a team that supports the development of innovation within the MCA. So I primarily look at autonomy and remote operation as it's being introduced, but we also have a section of our team that deals with emission reductions, such as hydrogen and ammonia fuels and the use of batteries. So our primary purpose is to facilitate projects such as getting new vessels out on the water or conducting trials, um, changing the regulation and starting to bring that change in. Sorry. And what that might look like, and then influencing the wider change. So particularly for me, this includes working with the IMO to try and develop the international regulation to support the wider use of autonomy. So I'm going to start at the very highest level or broadest scope and of international regulation with UNCLOS, which stands for the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it is one of the linchpins of international regulation for maritime. We are on the third version of the convention now, and as you can see, it took a long time to negotiate between 1973 and 1982. Now, part of this was the tricky negotiations between countries to ensure that each one balanced the rights of the smaller nations with the larger voices. And they took a particular approach of going for the voice of concession between them rather than having a vote or any dominant forces in it. The convention was finally ratified in 1994, and that's when it came into force for the UK as well. It establishes the framework for all maritime and marine activities. Now, I have an asterisk there because it's all that they could have thought of at the time. And as you can see for autonomy, it's one of the areas that was overlooked. The another one that's, apologies, it keeps jumping. Another one was marine biodiversity, which is of particular interest at the moment because there are international negotiations going on to work on that. Some of the areas it covers are national boundaries, like our territorial seas, exclusive economic zones, rights of passage, particularly innocent passage, and the uses of resources by nations. So this includes deep sea minerals and fishing. 167 countries have signed it, as well as the European Union. And at this point, any nation that chooses to join the United Nations also becomes a signing member of this convention. So how does this relate to autonomy? Well, as I alluded to, it wasn't something they were really thinking about back in 1982. So one particular aspect is underwater technology has been around for a long time, and that's been autonomous, but it's barely captured within UNCLOS. There is one reference to any form of underwater vehicle, as you can see in Article 20 on the screen. So right now, the UK is holding an inquiry into whether we consider UNCLOS fit for the 21st century. So part of this is looking at the recent developments of autonomy and how it might fit into the existing framework. How can we enforce the obligations against it when this can already be a contentious issue for ships within the UK and internationally? Interestingly enough, the inquiry has issued its report that came out on the 1st of March. I have not had the time to read it and properly present the results to you guys. But the general opinion seems to be, from the witness statements that I have reviewed, that UNCLOS is considered a very flexible convention. So the first point that brings into this is that it is part of sets of conventions covered by the Vienna Treaty, which, as my crude legal understanding takes it, means that the intent rather than the letter of the convention is looked at. So where something is intended to cover the innocent passage of a ship, that can be taken to mean autonomous ships in the future. But there is also case law surrounding UNCLOS, which has been negotiated at that international courts, particularly a poignant case around the Arctic summer. And I will double check that name if I've got it wrong, where there was negotiations or concerns around the terminology for hot pursuit and whether a ship that had been hailed over VHF could be considered in hot pursuit of another vessel. And the court determined that it could be because UNCLOS should be interpreted to allow for technology innovations as they occur. So a key part of the legislation that underpins UNCLOS is the work done by the International Maritime Organization. UNCLOS, as it stands right now, often refers to internationally accepted standards, rules, and regulations, and that is understood to be the work done by the IMO. So the IMO is got a mission to ensure the safe, secure, and efficient shipping on clean oceans. It issues around 50 conventions that cover things such as marine pollution, the technical aspects of ship design, polar water, navigation, and the extras needed. To do this, it's structured as you can see. So it has an assembly of which nations are voted into for, I believe, a 6-year term, and a council that sits under that. These two bodies set the overall strategic direction of the IMO in supporting the objectives of the United Nations. Below them sit 5 primary committees. We've got the Maritime Safety Committee, which covers the bulk of the conventions held by the IMO. There we go. And particularly focuses on the technical aspects of ship safety. The Marine Environment Protection Committee, as it kind of says on the tin, deals with marine protection matters such as ballast water pollution, greenhouse gases, and plastic pollution. The Legal Committee has a broader scope than some of the others in that it looks at the legal aspects in supporting the IMO as a whole, but also has a set of conventions that cover things like liability, passenger rights, and piracy and protection at seas. The Facilitation Committee has one convention, but it's quite a linchpin one in that it's there to enable the transfer of goods and trading across the sea. These guys are all supported by the Technical Cooperation Committee that takes the wider piece of international work and works to ensure the IMO fits in with it, and the Secretariat that do a wonderful job at managing the meetings, writing all the paperwork, and I'm sure a huge amount of stuff I haven't seen in the background. And sitting below there are numerous subcommittees that deal with particular, very narrow aspects, and nations send members to represent them at those committees as well, and they feed into their parent committees to make overall decisions. So the IMO has got a key strategic direction to integrate new and advancing technologies in the regulatory framework. And this is the key direction on which all the autonomy work the IMO has been undertaken has been done. So at the 98th session of the Maritime Safety Committee, they discussed including an agenda item to look at mass. For those that can remember, this was about the time that Rolls-Royce came out with their concept for an autonomous ship and stirred up all the waters. The way the MSC decided to handle it was to review all their current regulation to understand how autonomy might fit in with it. MSC completed their scoping exercise in May 2021. Legal and FAL also agreed to do regulatory scoping exercises. Legal has completed theirs, but FAL is due to complete this year. So just as a note, as I talk through the rest of this presentation, the IMO has conventions or instruments, and these can come in the. Sorry, let me put my teeth back in. These encompass all forms of mandatory and non-mandatory conventions, codes, guidelines, and recommendations that the IMO releases. It's something that can get a bit confusing when you're looking at all the titles as they change, whether it's called guidance or a code or an instrument going through. So the regulatory scoping exercise came in 2 stages. To be able to undertake that work, though at first they needed to agree what they were talking about. And this is where the definition or the term mass comes from. And you hear a lot of the wider international frame talking about mass as a term now, although in the UK we tend to refer to things as USVs, unmanned surface vessels. So they came up with the definition of mass, which is a ship to a varying degree can operate independent of human interaction. And then they came up with a set of degrees for it. So degree 1 is the closest to a conventional ship. I won't read out the definition for you, but it has got a full contingency of seafarers on board that can support the autonomy and the operations going on board. Degree 2 starts to introduce the concept of remote control or remote operations, but there are still people on board that can support the operation. By people on board that can support, this is informed people such as seafarers, not necessarily people as passengers or other third parties. Degree 3 starts taking the seafarers off the boat, and then degree 4 is considered a fully autonomous ship, which is capable of operating without any people on board and to a varying level of human in the loop for that decision. So the first stage of the scoping exercise involved assessing whether the instruments that the IMO has apply to mass. And if they did apply to mass, what impact they might have upon its operation. So this is going to work. Here we go. Here, this is this first list on the top here, where they categorized it into 4 groupings, whether it applied to mass and prevented their operations, applied to mass, but didn't prevent their operations, and nothing needed to be done. Applied to mass didn't prevent their operations, but we may need to look at how it applies or whether we need to interpret some of it. And then D, had no application to mass. The second stage involved taking all of those that did have some application to mass and viewing how they could be best amended going forwards. And this is the second list on the screen here. These included looking at using equivalences to expand the understanding of terms or use of regulation at the moment, amending the existing instruments to allow them to continue to be applied to mass, developing new instruments to only apply to mass, or doing none of the above, which was primarily used where they didn't apply to mass in the first state. Member states volunteered to take part and either lead these operations or support them, and then other member states provided comment on their initial work, and all of this was gathered together into papers on each individual convention. The Maritime Safety Committee chose to do this in 2 distinct stages with a set of paper for each convention, but Legal and FOW chose to combine the 2 stages together and get the results presented in individual papers for each one. From the results that were gathered, the MSC reviewed 41 instruments and it issued the outcome of its thing in a circular that is publicly available. You can find it and read the full descriptions of what has been done. They chose, because they had such a large number of papers, to group them into what they considered high priority, medium priority, and low priority instruments to amend. The majority of the low priority ones, you can see they didn't consider needing any form of amendment at this point in time. It may be, and they acknowledged this, that as the work was done that these might need to be reviewed as new definitions or terminologies were introduced. The medium-term ones were generally those they felt could be amended by existing or through amendment of existing conventions, or needed less work or significant impact than those that were high priority. The high priority ones had a combination of either needing a new instrument or significant impact in terms of the identified gaps and themes that I'll talk about later. It's quite hard to plot a multidimensional analysis on it to provide some overarching context, but I've tried to present the results in a graph so that you can see some general trends in the information. So degree 1 has the most forms of no amendment required to the instruments, and this is most likely because it is similar to the closer to similar ships at the moment, and therefore generally there's a seafarer available to intercede or carry on the duties as described in the conventions. As you increase the level of autonomy or go up the degrees, you can see an increase in the desire for amendment or developing a new instrument. Now, member states weren't restricted to any single option from the list. So this is why you end up with some multiple choices selected through the group. The other reason there is some choice or indecision between two options is because through an overarching review of it, if a new instrument was introduced, it could gather up a number of considerations and therefore avoid amendment needed. Or if they went down the route of amending individual instruments, it's likely that would need to be done to a lot of things. So there needs to be a balance between routes, and it wasn't for the regulatory scoping exercise to decide which way they were going to go. That was for the committee to decide on presentation of the results at the end. So the legal committee has also finished, and I have done my best to present their results here. They reviewed 19 instruments under their review, and their results can also be found in a publicly available circular. Again, it shows a similar trend with the majority of their instruments at degree 1 not needing any amendment. But unlike the Maritime Safety Committee, there wasn't as much need for a new, or any need felt for a new instrument to cover it. It was felt that by amending or introducing equivalences, they could handle the majority of differences introduced by mass. Again, this it could be due to the different nature between the committee's instruments. MSC deals with a large number of technical matters which have direct influence on the nature of the ship that they're applied to and have practical considerations in terms of the utilization of seafarers. Whereas the legal committee deal with ones, oddly enough, that deal with legal matters, which are much broader in scope but less generally applied to the ship. And I'm aware that sentence doesn't make much sense. So it's concepts like liability, public insurance, losing your luggage. These are the sorts of things that the legal committee deal with, and therefore can be more easily applied to something like a mass rather than to a conventional ship. FAL, as I've said, hasn't completed their RSE yet, but their working group has completed the rest of the committees. So they have one convention which they reviewed each clause in, but in general, like LEG, they have found that they can probably apply through amending or equivalence rather than a new instrument. All three of the committees looked for common gaps or themes across either the multiple conventions they looked at or within the convention they were looking at the time. As can be seen in the bold at the top of the table, they found again across each of the committees that they all had common gaps and themes as well. So things like the use of terms of master, crew, and responsible person If you've got a mass, does that necessarily mean that you have a master, especially if you've taken the seafarers off the vessel? And then how do you identify these people and what may their responsibilities look like when they're away? Terminology often is a hard one to interpret, especially for a new area. The terms that I spoke about before, the degrees and mass, have only been introduced for the regulatory scoping exercise to try and frame that work. There is work going on at an international level as well as a national level to understand what terms may be needed to be able to properly describe the regulatory landscape. Um, with the introduction of remote operations has come the concept of a remote operator, or a remote controller, or a remote pilot. And again, you can see the terminology issue in just this one point. How does the regulation apply to them? Can they be considered a seafarer? Or actually, because they don't go to sea, do they need to have exactly the same rights and protections that cover them? Do their roles and responsibilities need to look exactly the same? And again, this frequently came up across conventions and the different committees. The practicalities of a ship. So when you have a mass with people on board, you can have paperwork on board that vessel and you can hand that paperwork to port states or other authorities that wish to see it. When you start taking that off, what does that mean for the paperwork? How do you transfer it around? And again, as it's an internationally agreed level of regulation, being able to share that information in a universally accepted way is quite a key part. So certification and manuals was again a common theme. After that, common gaps and themes get more unique for each committee. So the MSc ones you can see have a more technical theme to them, such as manual operation, watch keeping, how mass impacts search and rescue, and the introduction of another novel concept such as remote control stations or remote operation centers. Legal had the liability aspect, and then foul because it deals a lot with the management of people, including refugees, stowaways, and that side of things had that as a primary concern, where there's obligations for inspecting on board a vessel. If you've got stowaways, how does that translate if you've got no seafarers on board? FAL also deals a lot with sharing information between ports and states, which again became a critical point. No exercise is without issues, and the regulatory scoping exercise is no exception to that. So some of the issues that came up with as part of the as part of the regulatory scoping exercise was the potential for inconsistent assumptions made by each nation. So although they tried to work on a set of terminology and frame the work so that it was all understood, some issues were open to interpretation. A particular one was around how passengers related to the degrees of autonomy. So some people assumed that you will never get a passenger vessel which could not have seafarers on board to handle and manage the obligations of those passengers. Other nations didn't agree with that approach. And personally, I can easily think of aspects where you will get a passenger ferry. We've got crossings across the Channel, crossing across the North Sea, even island hopping between the islands, all have potential to have remotely operated vessels without any seafarers on board because the journeys are short or continuously under the good search and rescue areas. But that's not to say that will happen. It's just some examples where I can already see possibilities. Due to the nature of the exercise where they were looking at regulation that already exists, it captured the known knowns very well, as I put it, areas that are in there that fit within traditional ships. But unfortunately, it barely touches upon what are the unknown knowns, things like remote operators, remote operation centers, and it really doesn't look at what are the unknown unknowns. What are people going to come up with next? How are we going to handle things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, high speed data, different communication links, and all those sorts of aspects? The mechanisms are there, but the regulatory scoping exercise didn't really capture those concerns. So what will the next steps be? Each committee came out with a slightly different outcome, so their next steps are probably going to look slightly different. But they did all agree that there needs to be some joint work between the committees. Whether this is a joint committee or a communication group has yet to be decided, but they need to address these gaps together. And particularly the other committees could do with the advice of legal in steering the direction of their interpretations for new definitions and terms. MSC is a step ahead of the other committees, so legal hasn't met since it's finished its regulatory scoping exercise, but MSC has. For any work to be done by a committee, they need to have an agenda item, and MSC proposed the new agenda item to develop a goal-based instrument for mass. So this is bringing in the concept that to regulate an innovative area, you need a flexible framework to allow for it, and that's the introduction of goal-based. Right now, the chair of MSC is developing a roadmap, taking into account the opinions expressed by various member states for what that next step would look like. This could involve the breaking down of the work by instrument, or whether we look at terms and definitions first, or any of the other gaps and themes that were identified. The next meeting for that is due in April and will be quite a pivotal moment for the development of mass. And something that I found out in doing all this work is although the individual papers are not necessarily available on public, there are summary reports issued from each committee meeting on the website, and it will generally contain information on what decisions were made. So updates and tabs can be kept on what the discussions are at IMO on mass. Those were some of the details. Looking at the long timeline, you can see right now they are finishing their regulatory scoping exercise. The framework for the introduction of new conventions means that it's likely to be 2028 before any new instrument or amendment to conventions would happen at the international level. So over those next 8 years, or 6 years now, sorry, the IMO will begin drafting that regulation. But domestically, we will be looking at our own work and what steps we can make of that. So right now we know mass is happening, so we're looking to facilitate that within our waters, and then there begins to look at the steps to introduce bilateral agreements between nations, most likely those close by, but then stretching further afield. By the time the IMO regulations have been written, they then need to be adopted by member states and ratified. This process usually takes about 2 years, but can be a little longer if there are pushback or controversial aspects of the regulations that not every nation likes. But hopefully everything goes smoothly, and by 2030 we'll have an internationally agreed regulatory framework. And that means by the time it's all phased in, ships are updated, 2040, it's all business as usual. And we're expecting, although it's by no means guaranteed, for the autonomy level or the amount of autonomy we see out there in vessels to be increasing across this time frame as people gain more confidence that this will be regulatory allowed and accessible for everybody. So after 2040, I'll be out of a job. So domestically, what are we looking at? Obviously, international regulations need to be ratified, and that's happened in the UK through a number of different acts of Parliament. The primary one is the Merchant Shipping Act and its various forms in there, which is an act that in itself amalgamated numerous previous merchant shipping acts together. So it's a bit of a Frankenstein's monster of an act in terms of the structure and approach within it. But it makes for very interesting legal reading when trying to work out how to apply this to the new concepts such as mass. We've also got key acts like the Aviation and Maritime Security Act, Pilotage Acts, and Harbours Acts. And interestingly, for this audience, out of them, the Merchant Shipping Acts are in general reserved matters, so are decided by the UK Parliament as a whole. But pilotage in harbours are devolved aspects, so need to be consulted with the other parliaments in the UK, which makes for an interesting discussion when trying to keep a coherent approach across the nation. So, what does changing legislation in the UK look like? Generally, and this is the whistle stop tour, bills are introduced before Parliament to introduce or change current legislation. They need to be scheduled, and getting a slot in Parliament is like gold dust, particularly after the times we've been through with COVID, where there's been a lot of emergency or higher priority stuff coming in. To support that bill position, policy position is developed. We then have consultations on that, of which we've already completed one for primary legislation information, and there'll be more coming in the short term. From those policy positions, policy instructions are developed, and this is what the legislation is written from. So we in the MCA don't actually write the laws as they appear on the books, but we do provide the context and the information to support doing that. Once all that hard work has been done, it's up to the ministers in Parliament, and that's when the real debates start. There's a package of work called the Future of Transport. With this, we're looking to introduce at primary legislation the groundwork to support the maritime framework for mass or autonomous vessels. It's the groundwork because it doesn't necessarily contain all the details for it, but it will enable future regulation to be built on top of it. We're looking to remove the blockers or uncertainty around terms like master and ship and seafarer, and introduce new terms like remote operator. We'll be looking to create powers for all sizes of mass to manage the new areas such as remote operation centres and ensure they're fit for purpose. Start covering autonomous underwater vehicles, get a handle on the newer dimensions for software, because it's not that software isn't looked at for equipment like ECDIS screens and AIS and that side of things, but there is a new dimension that means it probably needs a new approach for regulating. And then also ensuring that ports and harbours can regulate mass under their bylaws and those aspects. Unfortunately, without international agreement, these matters can only apply within the UK. But we are seen as a leader in this field, so other nations pay attention to what we are doing at the moment. And we don't really want to wait until there is an international agreement, because autonomy is happening now. We've got plenty of companies coming and talking to us and out there doing operations at the moment. But this is also an area that's been identified that the UK wants to lead in as part of our Maritime 2050 plans. So some of the work we've done in the future of transport was to introduce a tranche of definitions for consultation. And this is where consultation happened between September and November last year, and we asked a wide audience and the general public what their thoughts were on these areas and some of the new regulations we were hoping to bring in. So as we can see, we're trying to blend together the work that's going on at an international level and the regulation that already exists in the UK. So the terminology used within these definitions reflects some of those that exist already. Take, for example, mass master. This can include a person, except a pilot, having command or charge of a mass. That is almost identical to a master, but replace ship with mass. And again, you can see the same with the inclusion of the term mass as well. The hope is by introducing these terms, we can then start structuring the rest of the regulatory framework on them and making sure there's a common understanding, a common language when we talk about these vessels. Okay. So We received a lot of feedback from the consultation, and we've used that to inform our policy position and work on developing it. We're starting to gather sign off for this position across wide government stakeholders. So this includes both other government departments and other parliaments themselves. We're then also waiting for the opportunity to put this in front of Parliament and get the contents introduced. Now, whether this will be between as its own distinct act or as amendments to the Merchant Shipping Act is yet to be decided by the Parliamentary Council. That was at the primary legislation. Some work we're doing at the secondary legislation is in amending the Workboat Code. So this contains the more practical details on what these vessels look like in the UK. The Workboat Code covers vessels less than 24 metres being used for commercial purposes. And as a part of the general regulatory work, we're looking to update this from version 2 to version 3, partly taking into account the interpretation applications they had received over the last handful of years for the vessels, but also looking forwards and seeing what new areas would be good to include. So the current work has introduced 2 new annexes, one on electric battery powered vessels and one on remotely operated unmanned vessels. That term has been very particularly chosen because at the moment, the evolution of autonomy is so wide that it's hard to pin down, but also we have not seen that many examples of true autonomous vessels to be able to start structuring the regulatory framework off. So that means when you look at the mass market, actually the majority of those that are out there will be covered by this area. Well, that jump was actually quite timely. So as part of our work in updating the Workboat Code, we used a tool developed as part of the Maritime Autonomy Regulatory Lab work to use serious gaming to understand how new regulation might be introduced into the space and what that might look like. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we had to run these sessions virtually rather than in person. And you can see set up on the screen here one of the sessions that we ran. Down in this bottom right corner is the game board that we used, and that had a mission plotted out on it or a voyage for the vessel to undertake. This is the risk assessment design card on which the team designing the vessel entered all their information across a number of topic spaces and to consider other areas of it as well. Once they'd designed their vessel, they had to get it assessed against a survey card, which contained both current and proposed regulation. Once that vessel passed, it had to complete its vessel. But as we all know, no voyage goes completely as planned. So risk cards were drawn at random from a pack to test the vessel and ensure whether it could succeed or not. And that can be seen here. This session was very successful because it gave us a more holistic review of the proposed regulation and how industry might approach it. So although not the actual text that we were intending to use, it did allow it to be considered as part of the wider picture of the work that we were bringing in. It also allowed us to gain clarity on areas of misunderstanding where we may have written something not as well as we could, and develop and continue that discussion ongoing rather than getting answers that just said, that doesn't make sense, which then doesn't help us evolve our positions. In addition to that, as part of the traditional development of the new version of the Workboat Code, a consultation with the workboat industry was held. This closed in November last year, and we're hoping for a public consultation in spring this year. All of that is how we're hoping to manage these vessels and autonomy in the future. But right this second, how are we doing it? Well, we treat every vessel on a case by case basis. We use equivalence and exemption from current regulation based on IMO guidance for alternative designs to allow us to the to allow us to accept these vessels to operate in UK waters. This approach uses risk-based analysis such as functional hazard analysis and system integrity levels and other concepts to present a safety case of the innovative aspects to support the conventional survey and certification approach. Just some considerations as part of any of these processes. Current expectation is that where a vessel can, it should meet the existing regulations. So one of the most common examples of this is for the structure or stability of the vessel. We would expect to see that against accepted standards or codes like the Workboat Code to ease the application going forwards. We are looking to bring out a guidance for applicants as in the form of a maritime guidance notice shortly, which should hopefully ease understanding in this area. Although if anybody is going through this process, please come and talk to us because we're quite happy to explain what we're looking for and start shaping the discussion. Where risks are considered, we're very, very strong on ensuring that all risks are considered, those to third parties and the environment, not just those that are directly involved in the operation of the vessel. And then finally, I thought I would finish with some pretty pictures from my time as a systems engineer, naval architect, and project manager working for an autonomous shipbuilding company. So as a whistle-stop tour through them, up here we've got future proposals for minesweeping capability within the UK using autonomous vessels. We've got a surface vessel and an underwater vessel here from a project where I was working to enhance the underwater navigation of the underwater vessel. And this is another photo from the same project, which is one of my favorite photos ever taken because it summarizes the whole project in one shot. You have the control system for the vessel, and then in the camera shot, the once in a million chance of getting the vessel while it was underneath the boat in water clear enough to see it. You also have the acoustic communication system we were using to talk between the two vessels. This is another example of an autonomous vessel more aimed towards the long endurance survey. So although not present at the moment, it has the capability to carry a wind turbine. It's got a full deck of solar panels and then a small generator for the top-ups when the renewable sources aren't providing enough.